the Huntington welcomes you to the Humanities Forum for the Bluest Eye, featuring Soyica Colbert in conversation with production dramaturg Sandy Alexander. All events at the Huntington include a land acknowledgement. The Huntington acknowledges that our physical spaces stand on the occupied homeland of the Massachusetts people. We begin by acknowledging the Massachusetts tribe, from whom the colony, province, and Commonwealth of Massachusetts have taken their name. We'd like to pay respect to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants who still inhabit the land to this day. We honor and respect the many Native peoples who are connected to this land, past, present, and future, including the Nipmuc and Wampanoag peoples. And now, the Humanities Forum.
Okay, Soyica, I am so pleased and honored that you accepted my invitation to have a conversation with me about the Bluest Eye. I wanted to be in conversation with you because I respect you as a Black performance study scholar. You have very interesting and important things to say about Black performance. And, I wanted to see this play with you, in the way that pandemic times allows us to do that together. And that is a part, right? So I wanted to start off with a question, that honors the time that we're in, to think about how theater is happening virtually and your experience of it. So the first question is, you're a performance studies and theater scholar. So I know that going to see shows is so integral to the work that you do. I don't know how many shows you've had to stream to do the work during these times. I know that you had to stream this one. So I'm curious to know, how do you think you received the show differently from the streamlining vantage point? Did you watch it alone? Where did you watch it from? So in short, what was your virtual viewing experience like of the Bluest Eye?
So thank you so much, Sydney, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And I appreciate that one of the gifts, perhaps, or a silver lining of COVID, is that there are shows that I may not have even been able to physically get to see during normal times that I can now engage in. And so I don't know whether or not I would have been able to make it up to Boston during the run of the show, although it's something I probably would have been curious about and at least tried to do. But the streaming allowed me to do so. So that is, I think, one silver lining in terms of, a lot of scholars have talked about how rural areas now have access to regional theater in ways they didn't pre-pandemic, for example. So my experience of streaming the play was very similar to a lot of plays I've seen, which was me sitting in this chair in front of my computer by myself watching it. I will say that because I'm a theater scholar, I go to the theater a lot by myself. And one of the things that I'm often aware of is that even now, although the U.S. theater, since the racial uprising of 2020, has made a concerted effort of trying to diversify its offerings in terms of its programming, my experience is that U.S. theater's audiences remain predominantly white. And so often I would be hyper aware of my racial difference sitting in the theater by myself. I often will find other audience members physically looking to me in parts of plays for affirmation or direction about how they should respond, which I often find unsatisfying. But so when I'm sitting in my room by myself, I don't have that dynamic. But conversely, I also don't have the person laughing next to me or that communal experience and response to a piece of work, which is also a huge part of the theater. And so I definitely think that I miss, that aspect of being in a room together with people and seeing how different parts of a play resonate, even as I can see some of the other possibilities that open up by seeing a play via streaming. And so you had a different experience than I. you had the opportunity to see the play, be in the room where it happens. Could you talk some about how you think the play being staged in the round informed the piece, and any observations you had about the set?
Thank you so much. And I mean, your response about, predominantly white audiences, we could talk about that for days, Soyica, especially in, the Boston metropolitan area, and what that means. I think the setting, I think it takes us visually outside of Western notions of theater and storytelling. And it brings us instead to more Afro-diasporic ways and locations of storytelling, where there's a griot, a storyteller that retains the history and is telling the story in community with other people. So it's communal, it's collective, it's about community. And I think as a consequence too, it feels like there's a possibility for accountability, right? When you are able to see each other, when you're facing each other on the stage, right? It feels like you have to account for your actions on stage when people see you, when people are looking at you, right? Because there's that moment where Charlie says, "I'm not sure it happened," right? And then everybody else says, "It happened," right? So it feels like, because you actually have to make eye contact with people, you have to, you have to account for your behavior. So, it lends that sense of responsibility, I think, to the actors. And circular, in very kind of literal ways, also points to how cyclical the story is, right? Because it relies so much on the change of seasons. It relies so much on themes of life and death, right? So the circle makes a whole lot of sense for the story that the Bluest Eye is telling. And the circle, you might not be able to see it. I don't know if you saw it from the streaming, but the circle is actually a tree. It's like yes. So it has all of these resonances, right? With the tree of life, with what it means to be outside, but not outdoors, right? And the potentiality there of being outside and telling stories. So yeah, I think that's what it does.
Lovely.
Oops, sorry, I just muted myself. So my next question for you is the following. So, Lydia Diamond talks about being so appreciative that Toni Morrison agreed to let the novel have a new life in the form of a stage adaptation. And in her own foreword to The Bluest Eye, Morrison talks about regretting that, quote, many readers remain touched but not moved by the novel. So how do you think Black theatrical performances move audiences in ways that a novel might not have the capacity to do?
So I think it's part of what you've described really beautifully, in that you are in a theatrical production. When you're there live, you're not only responding to what's happening on stage, but you're responding to the whole environment in which you're in. And so, there can be a rippling effect of how the emotion resonates throughout the room. I also think that, one of the things that's distinctive about theater and, differentiates it from a novel is that when you're reading a novel, you're imagining the world of the play in your head. And I think that there's a difference in actually physically seeing in real time the representation of violence towards a young girl, for example. and having to process and hold that, as you've described, take responsibility for being in a spectator, or as Baldwin would say, a witness to what's happening. And so it's in that way that I think that theater can move you, because you're really engaging with the materialization, the making material, what had otherwise been imagined as a reader with a novel. And again, the other piece of a novel, and I guess this is more akin to my experience of streaming the play, is that, you know, we often read by ourselves. And so we're in our own little world, and we're able to then dictate the pacing of events. We're able to dictate the duration of our engagement, versus a play. I mean, I suppose one could get up and leave, but the expectation is that people will sit through the duration of the performance. Versus a novel, you might read a chapter, put it down, come back, come to a part that you find to be difficult, and decide to take a break. The ongoing nature of a theatrical performance, save an intermission, is that you are in the action for however long that duration is. And so it requires a different type of engagement from the audience. And the final thing that I'll say is that one of the lovely parts about being in the theater is it's one of the few activities that remains less distracted than our other ways of being in the world. And so again, you could be reading a novel, put it down, respond to a text, have, you know, your email go off, put the novel down, come back. Once again, in a play, I'm sure people check their phones and so forth, but to my mind, my experience of being in the theater is that it remains a less distracted activity. And so it then is able to envelop you in ways that other reading a poem or a novel may not achieve in our 21st century context. And one final thing, and this leads to my question to you, I think that the play does a really good job of asking us to think about how we see the different women and how our expectations around them resonate with the language of the play. And so I wonder, you know, there's all of this conversation around beauty and ugliness in the play and how that relates to Blackness. And so I'm curious how you think that mapped in a 21st century context, because we know Morrison wrote the novel in the late 20th century. And I suppose, and I didn't give you this ahead of time, but I suppose also how that resonates when we see the different actors or the different scenes coming to represent those descriptions.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer too. I love the visual and the word envelops. I mean, it's so true. So thank you for reminding audiences about that. You know, I guess there's so many different facets to current day conversations about Blackness. You know, but the one that most readily comes to mind is, you know, Tandy Way Newton's tearful apology to dark-skinned Black women for her being the one who is often chosen over them for movie roles. You know, the conditions that enable, you know, this kind of, you know, statistically remarkable over choosing of her over others, you know, I don't think it requires an apology, especially not from her, right? It seems to me, you know, that these colorist conditions require a careful looking into and ultimately, you know, a dismantling. And one that she could take part of if she so chooses. But yeah, one that does not require the onus to be on her to do the apologizing, right? Because there are conditions that have created this, you know, this defaulting to Newton as opposed to others, right? So, and I bring Newton up too, because as you well know, you know, she played Beloved in Jonathan Demme's film adaptation of another Morrison novel, Beloved, right? You know, because of the recent controversy, it feels like, you know, she could very well play another character, right? And that is Maureen Peale, right? So it's interesting to me, you know, in the I can't help it if I'm cute and you're not kind of way. You know, so it feels like so much of 21st century conversations about Blackness are not necessarily graduated conversations. They haven't been upgraded, right? I hate to bring Disney into the mix here, but this notion of beauty and ugliness, it's a tale as old as time, right? And it keeps recurring. And I know that it's a conversation that I will have to have with my own daughter, right? About, trying to preempt feelings of being less than, especially when those feelings feel like they're inevitable in the context of an anti-Black society, in the context of a society where, you're overfed images of yourself as the category of ugly, right? So
I'll say, Sandy, just to push back against, can you hear me? Against
yes,
inevitability. Whenever I teach this novel, I always ask, and we never come up with a good answer, but I always ask my students, what conditions produced Claudia's ability to not buy into this context, right? To not adore Shirley Temple, to not see herself as less than. So I do think that Morrison offers us, without giving us any conclusions, and
yes. So are you asking me that question
no,
too?
I'm not. I just wanted to say that,
Mm.
I think that that's something that's lovely about the novel, that we are in a world that seems like that this is the unavoidable outcome, but then Morrison gives us Claudia as another possibility.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I was in a conversation with Awoye Timbo, the director. And at some point I said, I wish I had, that kind of Claudia chutzpah when I was younger. I certainly did not have it. I think I would have been just as enamored of Shirley Temple as, Piccola was. So yes, Morrison definitely gives us this other option, but she also tells us too that Claudia ended up just kind of performing the script of liking Shirley Temple in the end, right? So as to not feel like she's so other from her peers. Yeah, so that's my sense, right? Is that it's a tale as old as time that continues to surface, and sometimes surface, as I said in this one example, in ways that tell us that there's maybe trauma at the root of a lot of this, right? Unprocessed trauma.
Yeah.
Mm. Okay. Here's my last question for you, Soyica. So as both a Black studies and a performance studies scholar, I really think you're uniquely qualified to talk about this play. So what, if anything, do you look for in a stage adaptation of a novel that you are already very familiar with? Did you go in hoping to see a certain scene performed from the novel, or did you go in hoping that you wouldn't see a certain scene performed? So I guess it's a question about expectations based on your understanding of the novel, of Morrison, of Black studies.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very tall order for an adapter when they're working with a text that's very well known. That being said, I think the general charge or the assignment for the adapter is to create something new. And an adaptation, I don't think, should have fidelity to the narrative arc necessarily of the novel, or to include every detail of that arc, or to have the same emphasis on subplots that the original piece has, because there's not enough space in a theatrical adaptation to truly have fidelity to the number of subplots that you might have in a novel, for example. And so an adapter has to make a lot of choices that fundamentally change the arc of the narrative in some way. And I think that a good adaptation is in many ways an interpretation of the story that uses the novel in this case as a reference text, but then also offers us something new and exciting. And it does so not only through deciding which parts of the story it will emphasize and which parts it will let fall away, but also how it invites different collaborators, the director, the designers, to create the world of the play alongside of the adaptation, and perhaps creating or shifting the roles of different figures and how they are realized in the action of the play. And so I really enjoyed this adaptation. I mean, it did not leave me wanting for different parts of Morrison's novel. I think it did bring alive in dynamic ways the relationship between the girls, which has always been central to the novel. And it allowed us enough insight into Pacola's parents to understand the world that helped shape her. I mean, the intergenerational transfer of trauma that really informed who she was. So I think that all those pieces were really successful. That being said, I've gone to great adaptations of plays of other works that I know really well and said, oh, I can't believe they left out, this thing. So even as I know as a theater scholar, these are the choices one must make, I still have had that reaction, I must admit. But that being said, as a general rule of thumb, I do think the adapter's job is to make these tough decisions and to create some coherence in a new form. And so speaking of choices, one of the gifts of creating theater is, again, you are designing the world. So, in a novel, Morrison might reference a song. And if you know the song, you might hear it playing in your head. Conversely, in a theatrical production, you're making sound design choices to create that world. And so one of the things that struck me about this production was the incorporation of song. And so I'm wondering if you could speak some about how the singing functioned and how you think it added to the production.
Yes. Oh, the singing. Oh my goodness. The short answer is I think the singing was about catharsis, right? I think singing can function as a way of sighing. Like it's certainly an extended and musical version of sighing. But when Mrs. Breedlove is singing Precious Lord, Take My Hand, right? She says she's tired, she's weak, right? So she is sighing in a way, by singing that gospel song. So yeah, it feels like relief, especially to, what I was hearing after seeing the play from a lot of people was that this was intense, right? So, I mean, singing helps to relieve, I think, some of that intensity for sure. It's a way of exhaling, it's a way of transitioning from one emotion to another. And it's also a way of transitioning from one part of the stage to another, right? So singing helps to actually move the characters. And I think there's something about the movement too that helps to do some of that releasing of how intense a scene might have been. So singing makes way for dancing, makes way for movement. So yeah, it's a form of sublimation, because a lot of what's going on too, I mean, we have those very balletic, I would say, moments of violence, right, that I feel do need to be shaken off, right, in a way. Singing is also a connection to the divine, right? I mean, it's a way of saying, there's a world beyond the one that I'm in, beyond the plight, beyond the emotion that I feel mired in. So there's that. And I also see singing as a way of being seen, in a world whose impulse it is to render you invisible, as the play focuses on, that theme of invisibility and beauty and ugliness. Singing gets you heard, right? Singing, it feels like singing is the language of the unseen, right? Like if in this world, you are rendered invisible, what's the loophole? Like, what's the hack? And I think the hack is you got to sing your way to getting attention, I think.
I love that. Yeah, the
Yeah.
complexity of emotion and the different things that people hear.
Yes, exactly. Oh my God. And that goes back to the first question, Soyica. I mean, about how, yeah, there were people laughing at certain places in the play, and you're like, what did you hear that I didn't hear? That was the reaction that you had, you know? So for sure, for sure. So yeah, so thanks for coming full circle in the end.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been great. I hope that everyone sees the play. I hope they have the opportunity to see it in person. But a gift that Huntington Theater is offering us is for those of us who can't be there in person, we get to still see this beautiful offering.
Indeed. Oh my gosh, please go and see the play. It's amazing. And the cast is just, yeah, they're just good people. All right. Thank you, Soyica.
Thank you.